It started with a curry. Not mine. I was minding my own business in the kitchen, politely avoiding Fritz's murderous glare as I made a ham sandwich without his approval. No, it was Wolfe's curry, which is notable because Wolfe doesn't eat curry. Says turmeric offends his glands. But there it was, sitting like a taunt in the middle of the polished dining table at lunchtime. The air thick with cardamom, cloves, and something sharper that Fritz swore he didn't put in. Now, you might think a misplaced spice is not enough to set off Nero Wolfe. You'd be wrong. There are things in this world that disturb the balance of power mist orchid bloom. A ruined sofa, or in this case, a ghost ingredient sneaking its way into Wolfe's sacred lunch. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply stopped chewing, placed his fork down, and turned toward Fritz with the slow pivot of a man betrayed by God. "Clove," he said, voice low and damning. "Why?" Fritz sputtered, hands trembling, swearing on his ancestors that he had used no such thing. I offered to taste it mostly for journalistic curiosity, but Wolfe waved me off, as if I'd suggested feeding it to his orchids. "Archie," he said, wiping his mouth with tragic precision, "fetch the spice rack." Now, let me say this. Carrying Wolfe's spice rack into the office is like dragging the Ark of the Covenant into a bowling alley. It's sacrilegious, it's stupid, and yet I did it. One by one, Wolfe sniffed, examined, and ultimately pointed out the clove jar. "This has been tampered with," he said. "Who entered this kitchen in the last 24 hours? That was my cue, because even if Wolfe won't lift his own considerable weight from the chair, when something in his universe gets nudged out of place, he becomes as alert as a bloodhound at a perfume convention. He didn't accuse Fritz. He didn't accuse me. He simply assumed, with the confidence of an emperor on a throne, that someone else had entered the brownstone, uninvited, unseen, and left behind a calling card in the form of spice. You think that's petty? I thought so too until I remembered the envelope that came that morning, unmarked, hand-delivered. Wolfe hadn't opened it. He'd handed it to me with a grunt and a shake of the head. "Discard it." He'd said, "I'm not receiving visitors today." I hadn't tossed it. I'd left it on the desk in the front room. Now, with Wolfe glaring at his curry like it had confessed to treason, I went back and retrieved it. Inside was a note, elegant script, no signature. "I have not come for your help. I've only come for silence. But if the truth finds its way into your mouth, I pray you choke on it. Cute, if we were in a pulp novel." I handed it to Wolfe without commentary. He read it once, twice, then folded it back and looked at me like I'd spilled sauce on his dictionary. "Find out who came," he said. "Someone has attempted symbolic cuisine, and I don't appreciate allegory in my lunch." That, my friend, was how it began. With an unfamiliar clove in an unrequested curry and a letter that didn't ask for help, but reeked of someone desperate to confess through denial. At the time, I figured it was a crank. We get them now and then. A bored heiress looking for excitement. A jealous cousin angling for attention. But Wolfe doesn't chase drama. He waits for it to collapse under its own weight and drag the truth with it. What he doesn't do is investigate lunch. So if he was stirred, then something bigger than seasoning was about to simmer under the surface. I put on my coat. I checked the locks. And I call Saul Panzer because if there's a chance someone waltzed through our kitchen and played puppeteer with Wolfe's palate, we were already behind. The game, as the man said, was afoot. But in our case, the foot was still resting, comfortably in a yellow silk slipper, planted firmly under 270 to West 35th Street, and sipping beer between deductions. Wolfe wouldn't budge, but the world was about to bring itself to his table uninvited, unspiced, and full of secrets. If there's a sound that doesn't belong in Nero Wolfe's brownstone, it's the doorbell at 3:30 in the afternoon, especially when we're in the middle of Clovergate. I had just finished tracing the path of potential spice invaders, milkman, mailman, and the usual paperboy, none of whom had come inside, when the buzzer growled. Wolfe doesn't believe in door chimes. He believes in rumbles, preferably ones that announce doom. I was halfway down the hall when Fritz intercepted me like a linebacker in a linen apron. She insisted. He muttered, eyes wide. She came to the service entrance. I should mention that when Fritz says she with that look in his eye, it doesn't mean what you'd hope. It means trouble. And right on cue. Trouble strolled into the front room wearing Chanel No. 5 dark gloves and a fur collar that hadn't seen daylight since Prohibition. She was tall, but not daunting, elegant, but not gentle, and when she saw me, she gave me a once-over that made me feel like I was an invoice under audit. Mr. Goodwin, she asked, voice smooth as liquor in a dry county. Guilty, I said. And you are? Someone with an apology, she replied, and a very specific memory of cloves. Well, that got my attention. She gave the name Viola Tarman. I didn't recognize it, but the way she said it suggested I should have. I led her into the front room, but Wolfe's voice boomed from the office before I could offer a chair. No, that was it. No, come in. No, who is it? Just no, as if the building itself had issued the decree. Viola didn't flinch. She took off her gloves one finger at a time, like she was peeling the truth off slowly. Tell Mr. Wolfe, she said, that I didn't come to be heard, only to be witnessed. That made about as much sense as oregano in apple pie. I knocked once, opened the door without waiting, and said, "We've got a visitor. Name's Viola Tarman. She knows about the cloves." Wolfe didn't look up. He was still seated behind his desk, staring at the spice jar like it owed him money. "Send her in," he said at last. "But do not sit." That was Wolfe code. It meant, "This is a courtesy, not an invitation." Viola stepped in, posture straight, scent trailing behind her like the final notes of a violin. She approached the desk, but didn't cross the red Persian rug, another unspoken rule. Wolfe looked at her once, nodded faintly, and said, "Explain." "I came yesterday," she said calmly, briefly. "You were in the plant rooms. I left a note, and I may have by mistake left something else." Wolfe's nostrils flared. The clove. Viola inclined her head. "It was in my pocket. It must have come from my kitchen. I didn't realize it had fallen. I didn't think it mattered." "It mattered," Wolfe said dryly. Why did you come here at all? She hesitated, and something flickered across her face. Regret, maybe, or calculation. I wanted to see if you were still incorruptible. That got a raised brow from Wolfe, and a grunt that could mean anything from curiosity to contempt. I've made mistakes, she said. Nothing criminal, nothing you'd care about, but I've found myself caught between two men. One has power, the other has spite. I'm afraid one of them wants the other dead or ruined, or both. And I wanted to know whether you could still be trusted not to sell what you learn. I watched Wolfe closely. His expression was unreadable, but I knew that look. He'd already made a decision. Viola had disrupted his order, walked through his kitchen, disturbed his food. She'd passed the point of no return. You may go, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin will escort you. Viola's smile was brief, almost resigned. You'll investigate anyway, she said softly, because you're offended, not because you care. She wasn't wrong. Wolfe doesn't like being underestimated. He likes being disrespected even less. She turned and left with the same deliberate pace she'd entered, never once glancing back. I followed her to the door, noting the small black purse, the spotless heels, and the faint tremor in her right hand. Fear or guilt either way. It meant she hadn't come for nothing. Back in the office, Wolfe had already summoned Saul Panzer. That was fast, even for him. She came unbidden, Wolfe muttered. She walked through the walls of this house, metaphorically if not literally. That is intolerable. What's the job for Saul? To find the men she mentioned. Power and spite are poor identifiers. But I trust Mr. Panzer will isolate the ones most likely to share her perfume. Do we know her connection to them? We will, Wolfe said. She left more behind than Clove. That was the second time he'd said that. And I was starting to wonder if it wasn't the spice that set this whole thing off, but the idea that someone thought they could slip something past him in the first place. Something had been disturbed. Not a crime, not yet. But Wolfe's brownstone had been breached in the only way that mattered to him, intellectually, symbolically, and that meant someone, Viola, or the men behind her, was going to pay for it. Wolfe's way, when Wolfe assigns Saul Panzer to dig, he doesn't mean shallow, he means grave deep. Saul's the guy you call when a background check needs a backbone. And in less than 24 hours, he delivered 3 names tied to Viola Tarman that could have powered a soap opera or a Senate hearing depending on the lighting. Wolfe didn't say thank you. He just grunted and asked Fritz to brew the oolong blend that means he's thinking. Now, here's the lineup, as fed to me by Saul and filtered through my own sleuthing. 1. Basil Kent, age 52, occupation public relations executive, more charm than cholesterol, which is saying something. Head of a boutique firm that specializes in reputation salvaging. Translation. He makes other people's messes disappear for a fee big enough to buy an alibi. Viola was once one of his clients. Then, according to Saul, she became more. They were seen at events, sometimes not seen at events, if you catch my drift. When it ended, there was no press release, just a quiet disengagement, and a whisper that Basil had demanded back a certain bracelet he claimed to have loaned her. To Miles Drosky, age 39, occupation, art critic turned gallery investor. No visible income, no visible morals, and a lot of visible cash. Saul found a sealed settlement between him and a rival dealer who'd accused him of laundering money through sales of emerging artists. Viola's name didn't appear in any paperwork, but she'd modeled for 2 of his featured painters. Rumor had it she also invested in his gallery's latest expansion and never saw the money again. Despite in Viola's cryptic line, "My money," said Miles, wore it like a cologne. 3. Evelyn Vance, age 45, occupation, executive chef and culinary, branding consultant. The curveball, Viola's former roommate from their lean years. They once co-owned a pop-up catering company before something went sour like left-out beignets. Evelyn went on to open a luxury kitchen school for Manhattan's upper crust and got famous for her spice psychology lectures. No joke. She teaches flavor profiles as emotional metaphors. And yes, she's been quoted saying clove represents betrayal when misused. I told Wolfe that. He didn't blink, just lifted his brow and said, "Noted." Wolfe had me draft 3 letters, each unique, each with a different bait. I mailed them by hand to avoid suspicion. One claimed Wolfe had been consulted about a culinary sabotage. Another alluded to a brewing scandal involving illicit gallery finances. The third simply said Wolfe had questions about a publicist's use of hush contracts. Wolfe signed none of them. He just waited. By Wednesday afternoon, the brownstone became busier than a police blotter during a heat wave. First to arrive, Basil, Kent, impeccably dressed, hair like brushed velvet, smelled like imported cedar. I met him at the door, and he smiled like I was his cousin's dog walker. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting me," he asked. "He tolerates your presence," I corrected. Leading him in, Wolfe didn't rise, didn't extend a hand, just looked at him like he was an unfamiliar fungus on an orchid pot. "You were once engaged in professional and romantic dealings with Miss Tarman," Wolfe said by way of greeting. Basil chuckled. "Ah, Viola. Yes, she does tend to reappear. Like an unfinished tune." He crossed his legs smoothly. "What's she done now?" Wolfe ignored the bait. "What have you done, Mr. Kent?" "That's how it went," Basil parried with charm. Wolfe countered with indifference. When Basil asked what this was all about, Wolfe simply said, "A spice." Basil blinked, said nothing. Wolfe waved him out. After 10 minutes, as if he'd reviewed a piece of furniture and found it structurally unsound. Next came Miles Drosky. He arrived with sunglasses on and didn't take them off until Wolfe told him, "I don't question objects. Remove those or remove yourself." He chose the former. Miles didn't sit. He hovered, moved around the room like he was casing the joint. Wolfe's gaze tracked him like a security camera. I stayed leaned on the doorframe just in case, though. The guy looked like he'd fold under a strong breeze. Still, he had that thing, the greasy confidence of someone who knows things he shouldn't. "Miss Tarman," Wolfe said, accused no one. But her scent lingered, and it carried the note of clove. Miles smirked. She always did have a flair for the poetic. "Are you saying she planted evidence?" No, Wolfe said. I'm saying she underestimated her own trail. Miles left. In a huff, claimed he was late for a meeting with a man who owed him 3 canvases and a truth. Whatever that meant. Last was Evelyn Vance. She didn't knock. She rang. She didn't smile. She appraised, dressed like a widow who'd decided to outlive her grief just to spite it. I came, she said, because Viola warned me you might, and because you shouldn't be sniffing through things you don't understand. Wolfe nodded. Enlighten me. You want to know about spice? Evelyn said, sitting without being told. Clove is assertive, dominant. It masks the delicate. It dominates the subtle. If it's in a dish and you didn't put it there, you're not the cook. You're the victim. I whistled low. Wolfe didn't move. She betrayed me, Evelyn added flatly, professionally, financially, personally. But I don't leave warnings in food. That's amateurish. That's almost a confession, I said. It's an insult. She snapped. I don't cook with spite. I serve it raw. After she left, Wolfe stared at the empty chair like it had whispered something unprintable. Then he turned to me. We have our suspects, he said. And one of them left more than a flavor behind. One of them left intent, buried, but potent. So, I asked, you believe this was more than symbolic? Yes, Wolfe said. The spice was not to warn. It was to provoke. Someone needed to be noticed. And what do you want me to do? Observe, he said, and listen. Saul will follow the threads. You will follow the silences. Someone will try to erase themselves. You must be present when they do, which is how I found myself that evening, sipping lukewarm coffee across from a struggling artist named Tanner Greaves, one of the painters, who'd used Viola as a muse. He was to drinks in and 3 secrets deep when he let something slip. She was scared, you know, he said. Not of Basil or Miles, Evelyn. That woman knows how to slice a person without leaving a mark. I asked him to elaborate. She once told Viola, even Clove has a breaking point. No idea what it meant. Viola stopped coming to sittings after that. I finished the coffee, tossed a bill on the table, and made for the door. Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair, but he'd drawn the circle, and now we were tightening it. It's easy for Wolfe to sit in his chair and spin the webs of deduction with a flick of his fingers. But it's the legwork, the groundwork, the slog through the gutters of the city, where the real detective work gets done. And that's where I come in. While Wolfe orchestrates the symphony, I'm the one sweeping up the debris, making the calls, following the hunches, and making sure the pieces fit. Now, the funny thing about Wolfe's approach to cases is that he doesn't rush. Everything he does is a study in precision. He doesn't jump to conclusions. He waits until the last possible moment before moving the chess piece. So, when he told me to find out what silence meant in the context of Viola Tarman's life, I had to ask myself, what part of her life was quieter than the rest? And how did the people around her fit into that? That's when I decided to take a look at the one person who seemed to be at the center of the tangled mess, Evelyn Vance. There was something off about her, something that didn't sit right. She had the look of someone who'd outlasted all her competitors, but at what cost? I'd been to Evelyn's kitchen school a few weeks ago just to check it out for myself. It was exactly what I expected, sterile, polished. A place where rich housewives could pay an ungodly sum to pretend they knew how to cook. But the undercurrent in the place had been interesting. I'd seen Evelyn's gloved hands working with precision. But her eyes? They were the eyes of someone who had learned to dominate, to control. She wasn't just teaching. She was molding people into something she could manipulate. I knew what I had to do next. I had to find a way into her world, make her think I was just another guy who didn't know his way around a kitchen. Lucky for me, Wolfe has a legion of spies, as he calls them, people who don't know they're working for him, but always seem to turn up the right details when needed. One of those spies was a bartender named Charlie. He was a regular at the place where Evelyn met her clientele, an upscale speakeasy, where the drinks were a little too expensive and the conversations a little too quiet. I'd paid him a visit that morning. Charlie's eyes were bloodshot, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, a sign that he had been cleaning glasses instead of flirting with the rich women. He didn't ask for the details, just the usual sum. After I'd paid him, he didn't waste time. "You want to know about Evelyn?" he asked. "She's a shark in a velvet glove. I've seen her bring down some big names in this town. But she's got a grudge against a few people. Not just the usual suspects. It's personal." "Personal?" I asked, leaning in closer. "What do you mean by that?" "She's got a way of making people think they owe her. But trust me, when the time comes, she collects. She's been hanging around some really shady characters lately. And I don't mean the usual gallery types or art buyers. I mean other kinds of buyers. Buyers for what?" Charlie lowered his voice. "She's been seen with a few heavyweights from the city's underground. People who specialize in less legal transactions. Art's not their only game. They dabble in other things." That was my cue. I thanked Charlie, grabbed my hat, and headed for Evelyn's office, where she had her second business location, a high-end catering consultancy, where she took select clients under her wing. It was a place Wolfe would never step foot in, but it was perfect for getting the kind of dirt I needed. Evelyn's office was exactly what I expected: sleek, well-lit, and as cold as a fish tank. She wasn't there when I walked in, but her assistant, a tight-lipped woman named Nancy, showed me in without hesitation. I wasn't exactly looking for Evelyn. I was looking for anything I could use to tighten the screws. As I sat down in the chair across from Nancy, I made sure to ask the right questions. "So, Nancy," I began casually, tapping the desk with my fingers, "what's the real story with Evelyn? I've heard a few things about her work. People don't exactly talk about it openly." Nancy didn't flinch, but I could see the gears in her head turning. She'd been warned about people like me, people who dug too deep and made everyone nervous. I could practically hear her thinking, how much should I reveal? "You think she's secretive?" Nancy asked, raising an eyebrow. "She's just careful. She doesn't like to talk about things that don't concern her clients. She's professional." I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough. "You know how it goes. The more a person acts like they're hiding something, The more you start to wonder. Nancy smiled tightly. Everyone's hiding something. Evelyn's no different. But she doesn't hide much, if that's what you're asking. She's got a few enemies. But who doesn't in this city? I pushed her further. Enemies. Do you know who they are? I don't get into it, she said, her voice suddenly cold. If you need to speak to Evelyn, she'll be back soon. I'm sure she'll answer any questions. I knew I was getting close to something, but I wasn't about to break down her office just yet. I left with a promise to return soon, but I knew I'd learned enough. Evelyn's ties to the underground world were growing thicker by the hour, and now I had to find out how deep they really went. Later that evening, I met up with Saul. He'd been tailing Miles Drosky for the past few days, trying to figure out what he was hiding. We exchanged notes, and Saul confirmed something I'd already suspected. Miles was keeping company with people whose hobbies didn't include high art. They were all connected to the gallery, yes, but there was a darker thread running through them, a connection to something bigger, and that something had its fingers all over Viola Tarman. I checked my watch. It was nearly 10 p.m. Wolfe would be up, of course. When Wolfe is interested in a case, he's not sleeping. I called him to give my progress report. Wolfe, I said, I think I've got a trail. And I think Evelyn's the key. She's connected to people who could be behind Viola's entire mess. Wolfe's voice was steady, unsurprised. You're behind the curve, Archie. I already know that. What do you mean? I mean, I've already figured out that Evelyn Vance isn't just playing in culinary circles. She's managing a few select players. What I need you to do is find the bridge between them. I hung up and left for the brownstone. The night was just beginning, and I had the feeling that this case was going to get a lot messier before it. Cleaned up. It's often the smallest things that matter most in a case. You can track a man's movements for hours. Collect evidence until the walls start crumbling under the weight. But it's the small, almost unnoticed things that bring the whole mess together. I've seen it 1,000 times. One misplaced glance, a half-forgotten word, a subtle gesture. And Wolfe, well, he's never missed a single one of those details. He never would. So when I walked into the brownstone the following day and found the small thing that had been moved, I knew we were getting close. I'd been out most of the day following leads. I checked in with Charlie at the speakeasy, confirmed Evelyn's ties to more shady characters, and sat through a few too many of Miles Drosky's high society art sales. But when I stepped into the office at 270 to West 35th, I noticed something off about the spice rack. The first thing I thought was that it was nothing, a small thing. I'd been gone for most of the afternoon, and Wolfe never touched it. I knew that. But there was a slight displacement in the jar of cloves, just a slight shift in the way it was standing. No one else had been in the room that I knew of, but still, the change was there. I didn't need to ask Wolfe. I could already see the contemplation in his eyes. He was staring at the spice rack, not with the usual dispassion, but with intent. Someone was here. He said simply. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a deduction. It was a statement. delivered with the precision of someone who had been waiting for confirmation all along. I raised an eyebrow, checking the rest of the room for other signs of intrusion. But there was nothing. No sign of forced entry. No discarded paperwork. No indication that anyone had even entered through the front door. But that small shift in the spice jar told me everything I needed to know. Someone had crossed the line, had come into the brownstone, and had been careful enough to leave only the faintest trace behind. Who? I asked, knowing Wolfe had already seen the same thing. I had. It is not who, Archie, Wolfe replied slowly, turning his gaze back to the jar. It is what? It took me a moment to catch up, but then it hit me. There had been no real disturbance. Whoever had been here hadn't rifled through the desk or scattered papers. They had been in and out in a matter of seconds. They hadn't taken anything or left any obvious trace except for that one thing, the spice. You think it's someone who's trying to be discreet? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Wolfe didn't respond immediately, his mind clearly working. At full capacity, he leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Yes, but with one key detail missing. Whoever this is, they're not trying to hide their actions. They're making a statement. The statement, I thought, the spice. Whoever had been in here was not simply trying to conceal their presence. They were reminding Wolfe of something, reminding him that they were watching, that they knew he was watching too. A dangerous game of cat and mouse. Where do we go from here? I asked. Wolfe stood up, his frame filling the room with a sudden intensity. I believe we have been given a second chance, Archie. It is time to pay attention to what others may overlook. I followed him as he moved to the filing cabinet, retrieving a few key documents that Saul had provided. Wolfe's fingers flipped through the papers with the precision of a surgeon's hand, each movement deliberate, each pause calculated. The person who left that clove behind, Wolfe murmured, is not content with silence anymore. They're making noise. And with that, he pressed the papers onto the desk. We've gathered enough about the suspects, Archie. It's time to understand the message behind the intrusion. I didn't need further explanation. We had enough names, enough motives. Viola had been a catalyst, but now it was clear that her actions, whether intentional or not, had set something larger into motion. Wolfe was methodically piecing it together, and I could almost feel the pieces clicking into place. I headed back out to follow up with a few of the leads. There were still questions to answer, questions that could bring us closer to the person who'd crossed the line into Wolfe's world. A person who knew just enough about Wolfe's routine to slip past every layer of security without leaving. A trace. Saul had reported back that Basil Kent had been seen meeting with a known art dealer, someone tied to the shady side of the business. Miles Drosky had been in touch with a financial backer who had questionable connections in the city's underground circles. And Evelyn Vance. She had been seen in a back alley, speaking with someone I didn't recognize, someone who wore a scar across their cheek like it was a badge. I knew Wolfe was already steps ahead, but I still needed more. More to connect the dots, more to tie the suspects together in a neat little bow. I couldn't stop thinking about the spice jar. Someone had planted it there, someone who wanted us to ask questions. Who wanted Wolfe to play along with the game? They were setting up. It didn't take long to find my next piece of the puzzle. I caught up with Evelyn at her kitchen consultancy office later that afternoon. She was in a rush, no doubt headed off to lecture her paying clients. But I needed to ask her one simple question. "You've been visiting the wrong kind of people lately," I said, leaning in the doorway as she tried to shuffle past me. Evelyn's eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place. Was it annoyance? Fear? It didn't matter. She was defensive, and that was enough. "I'm not sure what you're insinuating, Mr. Goodwin," she said coolly, "but I don't entertain just anyone." I crossed my arms, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not talking about who you entertain. I'm talking about who you owe." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might slap me. Then, just as quickly, her expression softened. "Who I owe?" she repeated quietly. "You really don't understand, do you? The world is full of debts that can't be paid in cash. And I suppose clove is the interest?" I asked, more to provoke than to answer. She smiled. But it wasn't the smile of someone who felt in control. It was a smile of someone who was trying to buy time, trying to deflect. "Goodbye, Mr. Goodwin," she said, brushing past me. "I've told you all you need to know." She left, and I knew just as Wolfe had predicted that Evelyn was hiding more than she was letting on. She knew something, and she was just as careful as the person who'd moved that spice jar. Careful, but not careful enough. When I got back to the brownstone, I could almost feel Wolfe's mind still turning. The game was on, and we were finally closing in on the truth. If there's one thing that's inevitable in a case like this, it's that the pressure's going to build until it's unbearable. Wolfe can sit in his chair all day, letting the clues settle around him like puzzle pieces. But even he knows that eventually things have a way of snapping. And when they do, you want to be on the right side of the break. The morning after my meeting with Evelyn, the tension was thick in the air, like a storm front rolling in. The spice jar had told us something, but it hadn't told us everything. And the more I dug, the more I realized that there were forces at work here that even I didn't understand. There was power involved. And I wasn't talking about the kind you find in a corporate boardroom. It started with a call from Saul. "Archie, I've been keeping my eye on Drosky," he said. "He's not as clean as he looks. I've got something for you." I leaned in, already sensing that something had shifted. "What's he done now?" Saul was silent for a beat. Then he spoke again. Quieter this time. "He's been laundering money through an underground network. Art's just a front. The real game? It's the spices, Archie. The trafficking of rare spices. It's tied to an international ring that Evelyn's got connections with. It's all about power and influence." The words hit me like a slap. Spices. The very thing that had been slipped into Wolfe's curry. It wasn't just about culinary sabotage. It was a message, one that stretched far beyond the brownstone's walls. And it wasn't just Evelyn Vance involved in this ring. It was Basil Kent, too. He wasn't just a PR man. He was a player in something much bigger. I didn't need to ask Saul any more questions. I already knew what had to be done, but I wasn't going to rush into this one. This wasn't the kind of game you played by showing your cards too early. I went back to Wolfe's office, where he was already stewing over the latest details in silence. "Wolfe," I said, "it's bigger than we thought. Drosky's mixed up in an underground networker ring that traffics in rare spices. Evelyn's connected, and I think Basil Kent's in on it, too." Wolfe didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He sat there, unmoving, as if the information was nothing new. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "I knew," he said simply. "It was always bigger than Clove. I took a step back. You knew." Wolfe didn't respond right away. He took his time, organizing his thoughts, the way only he could. Then, finally, he looked at me, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Yes, Archie, but knowing is not the same as proving. We have to dig deeper, find the connections, the players, the motives. This is not a case that will fall apart easily. Whoever's behind this wants us to follow the crumbs, but not too fast. They want us to make mistakes." I nodded. Wolfe was right, of course, but as much as he liked to take his time, I was getting impatient. I had a feeling we were reaching the final stages, and the stakes were higher than we'd thought. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games, they were making a statement. And they weren't afraid of Wolfe's mind. They were hoping we'd trip up before the last pieces were in place. We had to act quickly, but carefully. "I've got a lead on Basil Kent," I said, checking the time. "He's due for a dinner at an upscale restaurant tonight, meeting someone he doesn't want anyone to know about. I'm going to follow him." Wolfe didn't look up. "Very well, Archie. But remember this, never be seen." It was advice I had heard 100 times before, but it was just as relevant now as it had ever been. Wolfe knew the game better than anyone. It wasn't about brute force. It was about watching and waiting. I left the brownstone fully aware that we were getting closer to the truth. But as I stood on the curb, watching the dark city unfold around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to go wrong. It was one of those gut instincts that's too strong to ignore. I made my way to the restaurant where Kent had been spotted. It was an exclusive place, dark, intimate, and expensive. Not the kind of spot where you'd expect to find a man like Kent having a casual meal. I slipped inside, blending in with the crowd, and took a seat near the bar. I ordered a drink, casually surveying the room for Kent. It didn't take long. He arrived 10 minutes later, walking in like he owned the place, his polished shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floor. He was alone, at least, at first. I waited, watching as he settled into a booth in the corner, his back to the rest of the room. Something about his posture was off. He was too stiff, too aware of his surroundings. This wasn't just a dinner. He was waiting for someone. It didn't take long for his companion to arrive. She walked in with the air of someone who had been expected. Tall, well-dressed, with sharp features that didn't belong in a place like this. She sat down across from Kent, and I noticed the subtle exchange of glances, the way they moved, the way they spoke. It wasn't just a business meeting. It was something more. I tried to make out their conversation. but the low hum of the restaurant drowned out most of their words. I could tell they were discussing something important, something dangerous. Kent was speaking in low, careful tones, while the woman's gestures were sharp, calculated. They didn't want anyone to hear. They didn't want anyone to know what they were planning. It was then that I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small, delicate vial. It was sealed, something I'd seen before in high-end pharmaceutical circles. The kind of vial you don't carry around unless you're dealing with something rare, something valuable. The woman passed it to Kent, and he slipped it into his jacket pocket without a second thought. That was the moment I realized how deep this went. This wasn't just about trafficking in spices. It was about trafficking in power. Whoever was behind this didn't just want control of the culinary world. They wanted to control everything. I left the restaurant quietly, making my way back to the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting for me, his sharp gaze meeting mine as soon as I entered the door. "You've seen something," he said, and it wasn't a question. I nodded. "Ken's connected to something bigger than we thought. There's a vial of something being passed around. It's the key to understanding the whole thing." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "We are on the edge, Archie. One wrong step and we'll be swallowed by the silence. We must act now." And just like that, the pressure reached its peak. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a race, and we had to stay ahead of the game, or everything we'd uncovered would slip through our fingers. When you're playing a game of strategy, you can't afford to make the first move without knowing the entire board. Wolfe has always understood that better than anyone I know. He's not impulsive, he's deliberate, methodical, and above all, patient. It's that patience that lets him set up his pieces sometimes weeks in advance, and then, when the time is right, he makes his move. And let me tell you, when Wolfe makes his move, he doesn't need to do much. The players around him, all tangled in their own lies and deceptions, do all the work for him. He just sits back, lets them crash into each other, and then steps in when they least expect it. That's exactly what happened when we started closing in on the suspects. After my night at the restaurant, where I'd witnessed the exchange between Basil Kent and his mysterious associate, Wolfe didn't waste any time. He knew this wasn't a case of misdirection anymore. The moment Evelyn Vance had been mentioned, he understood that the pieces were aligning in a way that was too calculated to be anything but intentional. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was already at work, his large frame seated in his favorite chair, his face illuminated by the desk lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. He hadn't moved an inch, but I knew the wheels were turning faster than ever. I took a seat in front of him and waited for him to speak. Wolfe never rushed his conclusions. It wasn't that he wasn't ready to act, it was that he was already ahead of everyone else, even before they knew they were playing. "Saul Panzer," Wolfe said after a few moments, breaking the silence. It was more of a command than a question. "He's the key, Archie." I looked at him for a moment, unsure of what he was getting at. "Saul?" "Yes," Wolfe replied, his voice sharp and measured. "Panzer has a habit of finding things people believe are hidden in plain sight. He's been tracking the money flow connected to Drosky and Kent. We need him to do what he does best. Saul had been working with us for weeks, gathering intelligence, making connections, following the money trail. He was the kind of man who blended in, who could pick up on the smallest details while staying out of the spotlight. And I had no doubt that he was going to bring us exactly what Wolfe needed. I could see that Wolfe wasn't going to act on instinct. He was allowing everything to come together naturally. He wasn't pressing. He was letting things unfold at their own pace. That was how Wolfe worked. He knew that in a case like this, everyone would reveal themselves in time. We didn't have to wait long. The doorbell rang just after midnight. The kind of timing that's too perfect to be coincidence. Saul was at the door, his face tired but sharp, his eyes gleaming with that quiet confidence he carried around like a weapon. "I've got it," Saul said simply, before even stepping inside. Wolfe didn't look up. He didn't need to. "Go on," he prompted. Saul stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate. He handed Wolfe a manila folder, thick with documents. Wolfe accepted it with a deliberate, almost ceremonial air. Without a word, he flipped through the papers, his face unreadable. I glanced over at Saul, who was leaning against the wall, watching Wolfe carefully. I could tell Saul was holding back something, some piece of information that he wasn't ready to reveal yet. He had that look like he knew he had found something big, but he was waiting for Wolfe to acknowledge it first. Finally, Wolfe stopped flipping through the papers. His expression softened just the slightest bit, and I could tell that we were at the crux of it. "This is it," Wolfe said, almost to himself. "What have you got?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Wolfe looked up slowly, his eyes glinting. "We've been looking in the wrong direction, Archie. The spice was never the real message. The message was always in the connections. Kent, Drosky, Vance, they were all playing the same game, just on different boards." I leaned forward, still unsure of where he was going with this. "What does that mean?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "It means that whoever's behind this didn't want us to follow the spice. They wanted us to follow the money. And they knew we'd eventually trip over the cash. They knew we'd connect the dots between Kent's shady business dealings and Drosky's art money laundering. But the moment they slipped up, the moment we started getting too close, they threw us off with the clove. It was a distraction, a very clever one. I understood now. The spice had been a decoy, designed to make us focus on the wrong thing. They didn't care if we figured out the spice was a clue. They wanted us to find the money, to uncover the dirty dealings, and then expose it in a way that would look like a typical crime. They were trying to frame it as a tale of fraud, of betrayal, of petty criminals vying for control. But in reality, it was about power. Whoever had orchestrated this was playing a much larger game. "Where does Saul come in?" I asked, piecing it together. Wolfe smiled slightly, his gaze flicking over the documents. "Panzer's been tracking a very specific movement of funds, Archie. Funds that are tied to an international consortium of business people, some legal, some less so. What Saul uncovered is that the person behind this isn't just connected to the people we've been watching. They're connected to everyone. I felt a chill run through me. Everyone. Wolfe nodded slowly. The network is bigger than Drosky, Kent, and Vance. It spans continents, with links to illicit deals, underground markets, and a network of businesses that operate in plain sight. It's not about art or spice. It's about a much larger empire, one built on manipulating legal loopholes, on controlling the flow of goods and people. I stood there for a moment, trying to process it all. The walls were closing in, the puzzle pieces falling into place faster than I could keep up. The man behind all this wasn't some low-level criminal. He wasn't just a disgruntled artist or a failed businessman. He was someone who had been playing the game on a global scale, hiding behind layers of legitimate companies and high society connections. And now, he was ready to strike. "Who is it?" I asked, finally pushing past the uncertainty. "Who's the puppet master pulling the strings?" Wolfe didn't answer right away. He let the tension build in the room, letting the weight of the question settle in the air between us. "It's someone we've already met, Archie," Wolfe said finally. "Someone who's been watching us all along. Someone who's been right under our noses the whole time." I could feel the blood drain from my face as it clicked. I already knew who it was. Viola Tarman. Wolfe's smile was slow and deliberate. "Exactly. Viola Tarman is the key to everything. She's not just a pawn in this game, Archie. She's the queen. She's been playing us from the very beginning. The game was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. There's a moment in every case when you can feel the end coming. Not in the way you expect, with a tidy resolution, a neat bow, and a soft sigh of relief. No, it comes in bursts of clarity, like cracks in the facade that finally start to show themselves. The noise dies down, and all you're left with is the cold silence of inevitability. Wolfe knew we were at that moment. The web was spun. The players were positioned, and there was nothing left to do but watch them collide. The pieces were all in place. The suspects had been narrowed down to a tight circle, and each of them was holding their cards a little too close. But Wolfe didn't flinch. He never did. He sat back in his chair, watching the clock tick slowly, methodically, like the rhythm of his thoughts. "I think it's time," Wolfe said, breaking the stillness. "Time to bring them in." I looked at him. All of them, Archie. The circle is closed. We will see who steps out of the shadows and who stays hidden. I nodded and moved toward the phone. I had already made the calls. Each one of them was on their way, and each one would walk into Wolfe's office unknowingly. At the same time, the trap was set. It wasn't about who was guilty anymore. It was about who was willing to make a move and who was going to fold under the pressure. We had them all. Basil Kent, the polished PR man with a shady side, Miles Drosky, the art critic turned art dealer with dirty money in his pockets, Evelyn Vance, the ruthless chef with ties to some very dangerous people, and Viola Tarman, the woman who had been orchestrating the entire show from behind the scenes. They were all pieces on a chessboard, and Wolfe was about to make his move. The first to arrive was Basil Kent. He looked just like he always did, immaculately dressed, smooth-talking, and completely unaware of the storm brewing round him. He walked into the office with his usual confident smile, but when he saw the look on Wolfe's face, the smile faltered for just a second. It was subtle, but it was there. "Mr. Wolfe," Basil said smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in front of cameras and in boardrooms. "I wasn't expecting this. I'm afraid I don't have anything to add to our previous conversation." Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, staring at him, his expression as unreadable as ever. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "You're mistaken, Mr. Kent," Wolfe said. "You have plenty to add. In fact, I think you have more to add than you realize." Kent's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. He knew better than to argue with Wolfe when the old man was in one of his moods. Next to arrive was Miles Drosky. He was just as cool and collected as Kent, but there was something about him that screamed discomfort. As soon as he entered the room, he took one look at the other men and stiffened. He tried to mask it, but it was clear he wasn't used to being around so much tension. "Mr. Wolfe," Drosky said, his voice dripping with feigned indifference. "I must admit, I'm not sure why I'm here. I've already told you everything. I know. You've told me everything you wanted me to hear, Mr. Drosky," Wolfe replied. "But I'm not interested in what you want me to know. I'm interested in the truth." Drosky shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting from Kent to the door. He didn't speak, but I could tell the pressure was starting to get to him. Then came Evelyn Vance. She walked in with her usual air of self-assuredness, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She simply walked in, crossed the room, and sat down across from Wolfe, her eyes fixed on him, as if she were daring him to make a move. "You called, Mr. Wolfe," she said coolly. "I'm here. What do you want from me?" Wolfe didn't reply right away. Instead, he glanced at me, and I knew what he wanted me to do. I moved to the back of the room, keeping an eye on the others. Wolfe, however, was unbothered by the tension in the room. He simply sat back, waiting for the last player to enter. And then there was Viola Tarman. She walked into the office like she owned the place, her presence almost suffocating in its intensity. She didn't look at anyone as she crossed the room. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was happening, and she wasn't afraid. Not of Wolfe, not of the men around her, and certainly not of me. "Well, Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice sweet but edged with something darker, "I trust you've all had time to think." "I've had plenty of time to think," Wolfe replied, his voice calm. "And now, Miss Tarman, I believe it's time for you to answer a few questions." Viola's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll answer your questions, Mr. Wolfe, but only if you answer mine first." Wolfe leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't in the air anymore. It was in the people who sat before him. "You came here for a reason, Miss Tarman," Wolfe said, his voice soft but commanding. You've been playing everyone in this room from the beginning, but I'm not going to allow you to continue the game. We know about the money, the trafficking, the manipulation. But what I want to know is why. Why go through all of this? What's your end game? For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in Viola's eyes. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest as if to protect herself from the weight of Wolfe's words. "Do you know what it's like?" she said slowly. Her voice tinged with a bitterness that surprised me. To be underestimated, to be ignored, to have everyone think they can walk over you just because they've got the money and the power? Wolfe didn't respond. He didn't need to. Viola was talking, and she was revealing exactly what he wanted her to reveal. "I built my empire on nothing," she continued, her voice growing colder. "I made deals with people who would have never looked at me twice if I hadn't shown them what I could do. I manipulated the ones who thought they were invincible, and I watched them fall, one by one." She paused, looking at the men in the room, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She was proud of what she'd done. "But why?" Wolfe said, cutting her off. "Why the spice? Why the clove?" Viola looked up, a twisted smile playing on her lips. "Because, Mr. Wolfe, everything comes full circle eventually. And when you've climbed to the top, you need to make sure everyone knows you're there." The room fell silent. The air was thick with the weight of her words, and I could see the final pieces falling into place. This has never been about art or business or even power, Wolfe said, his voice quiet but firm. This has been about one thing: control. You've controlled everyone in this room, and now you're trying to control me. Viola's smile faltered, and for a moment I thought she might break, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up, smoothing her dress with the kind of grace that only someone who's used to winning could manage. "I've played my part," she said, her voice steady, "and now the game is yours." As she walked out of the room, I could see the finality in her step. Wolfe had won, and there was nothing more to be said. The game was over. The quiet hum of the office settled into an almost unnatural stillness after Viola Tarman left the room. She had stepped out, confident that she had said everything she needed to say, her eyes daring Wolfe to make his next move. But I knew, as did Wolfe, that this was the moment that mattered most. This was where the game reached its end. The pieces had all been lined up, and the final move was about to be made. For a brief moment, Wolfe didn't say anything. He simply sat back in his chair, his fingers still steepled, and he stared at the door through which Viola had just exited. I could see the gears in his mind clicking into place, every detail, every move, aligning to form a picture so clear it was almost unnerving. Finally, Wolfe spoke, his voice calm and deliberate, like a man about to close the case after a long investigation. "Miss Tarman has played a very intricate game, Archie," he said, his tone reflecting a subtle satisfaction. "But she's made a crucial mistake. She believes that she can control everyone in this room, that she can manipulate the situation to her advantage. But she forgot one thing: I am not one of her pawns." I didn't need to ask what he meant. It was clear now. Viola had overplayed her hand, and in doing so, she had exposed herself. She thought she was the master of the game, but Wolfe was always 3 steps ahead. The pieces had fallen into place, and now it was time for the reveal. Wolfe glanced at me, and I knew what he wanted. I stood and made my way to the desk, where he had laid out the papers Saul had brought him earlier. The money trail, the connections, the dealings with Kent, Drosky, and Van Saul of it was now clear. Wolfe had connected the dots, and the picture he had formed was far more complicated than I had originally imagined. I've always said that the truth is like a pebble at the bottom of a pond. Wolfe continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It may be small, but it's always there, and when you look closely enough, it rises to the surface. Viola Tarman thought she could manipulate everyone around her, Basil Kent, Miles Drosky, even me. But she didn't count on one thing. The truth doesn't change, no matter how much. You try to hide it. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I could see the realization dawning in the faces of the men still seated in the room. They had been playing along, thinking they understood the game, but now they were seeing the full scope of the situation. The spice, Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the tension. It was never about clove. It was never about a culinary sabotage. It was about control, a message. Viola wanted to show us that she could dictate the course of the investigation, that she could pull the strings and lead us to where she wanted us to go. I glanced at the others in the room, Basil, Miles, and Evelyn. They were all watching Wolfe closely, waiting for the next move, but none of them were fully aware of the trap they had walked into. They thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know what Wolfe had uncovered. The spice, Wolfe continued, was a symbol, a clue that was designed to distract us. But it was also a test, a way for Viola to see if we could be manipulated. She didn't think we would figure it out. She didn't think we would realize the connections, the power plays, the network that tied them all together. He stood up, walking slowly around the room, his eyes fixed on each of the suspects in turn. There was no hurry in his movements. He wasn't about to let them off the hook just yet. He was savoring the moment. The truth, gentlemen, is that this case was never about a stolen piece of art or a simple business deal gone wrong. Wolfe said this was about something much larger. It was about power, about the ability to control not just the lives of the people in this room, but the lives of countless others. Viola Tarman may have been the architect of this plan, but she wasn't working alone. She had help, and that help came from someone we didn't suspect, someone who was always in plain sight. I could see the realization begin to dawn on the others. They were slowly putting the pieces together, but Wolfe wasn't finished yet. He was just getting started. Basil Kent, Wolfe said, turning to him with a calculating gaze. You're not just a public relations man. You're a man who understands the value of controlling the narrative. You've worked behind the scenes to clean up the messes that Viola created, to make sure that no one saw the true nature of her empire. Kent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Wolfe didn't let him speak. And Miles Drosky, Wolfe continued, turning his attention to the art dealer. You're not just an art critic. You're a man who's used art as a front for money laundering. You've been using your gallery to funnel illicit funds into a network of criminals. And Viola was a key player in that operation. But you were always one step behind her, trying to catch up, trying to stay in control. Drosky swallowed hard, but still, he remained silent. He wasn't about to confess without a fight, and Evelyn Vance, Wolfe said, his voice growing colder. You were never just a chef. You were a pawn in Viola's game. But you also saw the potential for power. You used your connections in the culinary world to manipulate people, to control their choices, and to ensure that your influence extended far beyond the kitchen. But you, too, were controlled by Viola. She knew exactly how to use you. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. She knew Wolfe had hit the nail on the head. And then there's Viola, Wolfe said, turning his gaze back to her, his voice cold with disdain. You thought you could control everyone in this room. You thought you could manipulate me, lead me to your conclusions, make me play your game. But you made one fatal mistake. You underestimated me. You underestimated the fact that I see everything, that I notice the smallest details, the ones that everyone else ignores. Viola stared at him, her defiance slowly crumbling under the weight of his words. You've been playing a dangerous game. Miss Tarman, Wolfe said, his voice low and cutting. And now the game is over. There was a long silence, the tension thick in the room. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of Wolfe's words hung heavy in the air, and I could feel the pressure building. The moment of revelation finally arriving. Viola, for the first time, looked vulnerable. She had always been in control, always 2 steps ahead, but now she saw the truth. She had lost. Wolfe's lips curled into a faint smile. The truth is simple. Miss Tarman, you thought you could play the game, but you were never the one in control. I was, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. I've always found that the aftermath of a case is never as tidy as people make it out to be. The air doesn't clear up. The clouds don't part. There's no big announcement, no grand finale. In reality, the truth is more like a quiet fade-out. It's there, it's settled, but it doesn't make much noise. People move on. Wolfe moves on. But I don't think any of us really forget the cases we've handled. They stay with you, just beneath the surface, like a song you can't quite remember, but know is playing somewhere in the back of your mind. After Viola Tarman's final admission and Wolfe's calculated expose, the pieces began falling into place with an efficiency I had come to expect. The men in the room, the ones who had once thought themselves untouchable, now seemed strangely small. Basil Kent, Miles Drosky, and Evelyn Vance, they had all underestimated Wolfe, thinking that they could play a game of manipulation without him noticing. But the truth was always going to surface, and when it did, they had nowhere to hide. I watched them each shift in their seats as Wolfe's final revelations hung in the air. There wasn't much they could say now. They had been exposed. Each one of them had been playing their part in Viola's game, a game that was always about control and manipulation. But now, they were nothing more than pawns on a board that Wolfe had already won. We didn't have to arrest them. Not right away, anyway. Wolfe never rushed into making decisions like that. He let the law take its course, but he had already shown the truth to everyone in that room. The real punishment wasn't in the handcuffs or the cell, it was in the knowledge that they had been outplayed by a man who had never lifted a finger. Wolfe's victory was quiet, but it was absolute. I could see the weight of it in their eyes. Trotsky's usual bravado was gone, replaced with a nervous energy that was impossible to hide. Kent, the public relations king, looked like his world was crumbling before him. And for the first time, I could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Evelyn Vance sat in silence, her proud exterior unraveling as the consequences of her actions caught up to her. As for Viola, she stood at the door, her back straight, but there was no defiance left in her. Her pride, her power, her control, all of it had been stripped away by Wolfe's calm, deliberate unraveling of her web. She had tried to manipulate us, tried to control the narrative. But in the end, it was Wolfe who had the final word. Your empire was built on lies, Wolfe said, his voice cold. And now it has crumbled, piece by piece. You thought you could control everything, but in the end, you couldn't even control yourself. Viola didn't respond. She simply nodded, her gaze flicking toward the door, as if she were already mentally preparing herself for the next step. She had already lost. But the worst part, at least for her, was that she had lost without ever having the chance to fight back. Wolfe's eyes never left her. You've made your bed, Miss Tarman. Now, you must lie in it. And with that, Viola left the room. Her exit as quiet and dignified as she could manage. The others followed suit, filing out of the office one by one, their faces a mix of resignation and guilt. They knew they had been bested, and they knew it was Wolfe who had won. The room was still for a moment, the tension that had hung over us for so long finally dissipating. I sat back in my chair, letting out a deep breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The case was over. The criminals had been exposed, and Wolfe had done it all without so much as lifting a finger. Well, Archie, Wolfe said, breaking the silence, I trust you'll prepare dinner. I'm hungry, I chuckled. Leave it to Wolfe to wrap up an entire investigation with one simple request for food. I had no doubt that once the paperwork was sorted out, he would return to his orchids, his books, and his chair, content with another case solved, another victory in his name. As I stood to head toward the kitchen, I glanced back at Wolfe. He was already lost in thought again, his fingers steepled, his eyes distant. The case was over for him, but it never really ended. It never could. There was always another puzzle, another game, and Wolfe was always ready to play. Dinner was served an hour later, and Wolfe, as usual, took his time. He didn't hurry, didn't rush. He ate slowly, savoring every bite as if the world around him had already melted away. I watched him, knowing that the case was behind us now. But I also knew that his mind was already on the next one. The quiet after the storm wasn't really quiet at all. It was a calm before the next wave, the next challenge. But for now, we had one, and that was enough. As I sat across from Wolfe, the weight of the case finally lifting, I allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction. We had done it. We had exposed. Viola Tarman uncovered the truth and dismantled the empire she had built. It had been a long road, filled with deception, manipulation, and power plays. But in the end, it was Wolfe's unshakable calm, his careful observation, and his relentless pursuit of the truth that had won the day. And that, as always, was the most satisfying part of the job. "Tomorrow, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the silence once more. "There will be another case, and we will solve it, as we always do. But for now, I believe we've earned our dinner." I raised my glass in a silent toast. To Wolfe, to the truth, and to another case well solved. The days following the resolution of the case were quieter than usual. Wolfe, as always, had retreated into his routine, his thoughts now focused on his orchids, his books, and his ever-present chair. But I knew better than to think the world had suddenly slowed down for him. For Wolfe, there was no rest, no moment of true respite. The mind that worked so relentlessly on the smallest of details could never really turn off. It simply shifted from one case to another, one puzzle to the next, as though the process of solving mysteries was as natural to him as breathing. As for me, I had my own things to deal with. The aftermath of a case like this isn't as simple as wrapping it up and walking away. There were still questions to answer, legal matters to settle, and the long process of tying up loose ends. But with Wolfe, it was always the same. He didn't care about the mundane details of the world that spun around him. All he cared about was the case, solving it, analyzing it, and understanding its complexities. And this one had been complicated, no doubt about it. What had started as a seemingly simple matter of a tampered spice jar had exploded into a tangled web of power, deception, and manipulation. Viola Tarman had tried to play the game, tried to control the narrative. But in the end, it was Wolfe who had pulled the strings. He had uncovered the truth, exposed the criminals, and shown them for what they really were, nothing more than pawns in a much larger game. I had never seen Wolfe more satisfied than in the moments after Viola's confession. The thrill of the hunt was over, but it was the quiet victory that meant the most to him. He didn't need accolades. He didn't need recognition. For Wolfe, the only thing that mattered was the intellectual triumph, the moment when everything clicked into place, when the puzzle was solved and the truth was laid bare. I sat across from him now, my legs propped up on the desk, my mind wandering back to the case. I still couldn't get over the fact that Viola Tarman had been the mastermind behind it all. She had played us, manipulated us, and used everyone around her like pieces in a grand chess game. But she hadn't accounted for Wolfe's ability to see through her web of lies. The moment she had underestimated him was the moment she sealed her fate. Wolfe sat quietly, his eyes focused on the stack of papers in front of him. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew he was aware of my every movement. His mind was always working, always calculating, and I knew that even now, as we sat in the aftermath of the case, he was already turning over the next puzzle in his head. "Archie," he said, breaking the silence, "do you think she'll be back?" I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where he was going with this. Who? Viola? Yes, Wolfe replied, his tone still measured. Do you think she'll come back for revenge? For power? I thought about it for a moment. No, I said finally. She's not the type to make the same mistake twice. Besides, she's been exposed. She's not going to risk coming after us again. Wolfe nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't entirely convinced. It's never about revenge, Archie. It's always about control. People like Viola, people like Kent, Drosky, and Vance, they don't stop. They retreat, they lie low, and they wait. And when the time is right, they strike again. I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. Wolfe had a point. The world was full of people who never learned from their mistakes. They didn't stop. They simply found new ways to disguise their actions, new methods to achieve their goals. Viola had learned a valuable lesson in this case. But she wasn't someone who would easily let go of her need for power, and that made her dangerous. But, I said, she's been exposed. The law is on her tail. She's not going to risk throwing it all away for a petty grudge. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. You underestimate the lengths to which people will go to retain control. Archie, Viola's defeat was only the beginning. The game will continue, whether she plays a part in it or not. I paused, absorbing his words. So you're saying this case isn't really over? Wolfe's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Not in the way you think, Archie. It's over for now, but the pieces are still in play. There's always someone, somewhere, trying to manipulate the system. And as long as they exist, our work will never be finished. I exhaled slowly, leaning forward in my chair. You make it sound like we'll be chasing ghosts for the rest of our lives. Wolfe chuckled softly. In a way, yes. But that's what makes it interesting. The world is full of shadows, Archie. The trick is knowing how to see them. There was silence between us for a moment as I processed his words. Wolfe was right, of course. The game was never truly over, no matter how many cases we solved, no matter how many criminals we brought to justice. There would always be more. There would always be new players, new schemes, new manipulations to uncover. That was the nature of the work, and Wolfe had long ago accepted that truth. We'll take a break for now, Wolfe continued, his eyes glinting with that familiar spark. But we're never done. The next case will find us, and when it does, we'll be ready. I smiled. Always ready, right? Wolfe's smile widened slightly. Exactly. And in the meantime, we'll enjoy our victories. There's no harm in that. I stood up, stretching my legs. Dinner? Of course, Wolfe said, rising from his chair. But I'm afraid we're having something a little less extravagant tonight. Perhaps a simple stew. Nothing too flashy. I laughed. You know, for someone who's solved the case of the century, you sure know how to keep things low-key. Wolfe shrugged, an air of contentment settling over him. There's no need for extravagance when the satisfaction of a job well done is enough. And just like that, the case was behind us. The criminals had been exposed. The truth had been revealed, and Wolfe had once again come out on top. But for Wolfe, The true victory wasn't in the accolades or the recognition, it was in the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, a mystery unraveled. As I followed him into the kitchen, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Working with Wolfe was never easy, but it was always rewarding. We didn't just solve cases, we learned. We saw the world in ways most people never could. And that, I thought, was the true beauty of the work. As we sat down to dinner, the quiet hum of the evening wrapped around us like a comfortable blanket. The case was over, but the next one would come soon enough. And when it did, we would be ready. It's funny how, when you're in the middle of a case, the world spins in a completely different way. Every moment feels like it's part of something larger, a piece of the puzzle that you're determined to solve. The pressure, the tension, the late nights, it all feels important, like you're chasing something that can't be ignored. But once it's over, once the dust settles and the criminals are exposed, you realize how much of the world continues to move around you, unaffected. The clocks still tick, the sun still rises and sets, and Wolfe still expects his meals on time. The world doesn't stop for a case, it just moves on. And that's what happened after the case with Viola Tarman and the rest of the players in her game. The phone stopped ringing with tips. The suspects stopped showing up at the brownstone. And for the first time in weeks, the office was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that reminds you of the calm before a storm. Wolfe didn't seem bothered by it. He never did. He was back to his usual routine, tending to his orchids, reading his books, and, of course, eating his meals at the same time every day. It's like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Wolfe never truly relaxed after a case. He always had that edge, that sharpness in his eyes, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for the next mystery to come his way. I wasn't as good at hiding it. The quiet felt off. I'd gotten used to the rush, the pace, the constant shuffle of suspects and clues. And now it was gone. All of a sudden, I found myself with nothing to do but watch the clock and wonder when the next case would show up. I was sitting in the office, trying to focus on a newspaper that I had no interest in, when the silence was broken. The door to the brownstone opened, and I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking on the floor, fast, purposeful. I looked up just in time to see a familiar face walk into the room. It was Viola Tarman. I blinked, not sure if I was seeing things. She looked different, less confident, more subdued. But there was no mistaking her. She was back, and I knew the game wasn't over. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked straight toward Wolfe's desk and stood there, waiting for him to acknowledge her. I could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself. She was a woman who had once been in control, and now, for some reason, she had come back to face the man who had exposed her. Wolfe didn't look up from his book. He never did until he was ready. I could see the way he was processing the situation, the calmness in his movements, the measured approach he took to every encounter. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "Miss Tarman," he said, "I assume you've come to apologize." Viola's lips pressed into a tight line. But she didn't answer right away. She seemed to be gathering herself, trying to find the right words. After a moment, she spoke. "I've come to make an offer," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something that was hard to place. Regret, fear. I wasn't sure. I made a mistake. I thought I could manipulate you, play you like I've played so many others. But you saw through it, and I don't think I can win that game with you. Wolfe didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he was waiting for her to reveal something more. "You're not here for justice, are you?" he said, his tone soft but firm. Viola's eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment I saw a flash of something like shame. "No," she admitted, "I'm not here for justice. I'm here because I need your help now." This was unexpected. I glanced at Wolfe, but he didn't show any sign of surprise. He just waited, like he always did, letting the other person speak. It was always the same with him. He never rushed. He never hurried. He let people reveal themselves, one word at a time. "I've made enemies," Viola continued, her voice quieter now. "Powerful ones. Ones who don't care about the law or the game I've been playing. And now they're coming for me. They want to make sure I'm silenced. Permanently." Wolfe leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk in front of him. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "And you want me to protect you?" Viola nodded. "Yes, but not just that. I need you to help me take down the people who are behind this. They've been controlling everything from the shadows, manipulating the people around me, and now they want me out of the way. I can't do this alone." There was a long pause. I could feel the weight of the room settling in, and I knew that Wolfe was considering his options. He wasn't one to act impulsively. He would wait until he had all the information, until he was sure of the next move. And in this case, I could tell that he was processing everything she had said. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "I don't deal in favors, Miss Tarman. I deal in the truth. And you're asking for more than that. You're asking me to go back into a game I've already won." Viola's expression softened, and she took a step closer to the desk. "I'm not asking you to play, Wolfe. I'm asking you to help me expose them, to make sure they don't get away with it." Wolfe sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled once again. He was silent for a long moment, as if weighing her words, considering the cost of getting involved once more. Finally, he sighed. "I've already done my part, Miss Tarman," he said, his voice calm but final. "You've already been exposed, and you've made your choices. The law will deal with you. The law will deal with your enemies." Viola opened her mouth to protest, but Wolfe held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm not interested in unfinished business. You made your move. Now, you must live with the consequences." Viola's face fell. I could see the weight of it on her, the realization that her plea for help had been denied. She wasn't going to get what she had come for. For a moment, it seemed like she might break down. The woman who had manipulated and controlled everything around her, who had played everyone in the room, was now standing in front of us, vulnerable and stripped of her power. But then, she straightened herself up, She took a deep breath and looked Wolfe in the eye, her voice quiet but steady. "I'll handle it myself, then," she said. "But don't think I've forgotten what you've done. I'll be back, Wolfe. You may not want to be involved, but there's always someone pulling the strings, and one day you'll see that we're not so different after all." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Wolfe and me alone again. For a long moment, I said nothing. Wolfe didn't speak either. He simply stared at the door through which Viola had just exited, his expression unreadable. "Will she come back?" I asked quietly, not sure if I was speaking out of curiosity or genuine concern. Wolfe didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently against the armrest. "She's already gone," he said at last. "And with her, her power. There's nothing more to be said." And with that, the game was truly over. The case was closed. The silence returned, but this time it felt final. The days after Viola Tarman left Wolfe's office felt like something out of a dream. A fog seemed to settle over the brownstone, not because of the case it was over, after all, but because something else had taken its place. The game had ended, but the air still hummed with the aftershock of it all. Wolfe, as always, had moved on. He was already back to his orchids, his books, his meals. But for me, the silence was something I couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't just the case. It was everything it represented, the way people like Viola could manipulate the world around them, pulling strings from behind the scenes, while those of us on the outside struggled to see the full picture. I'd seen Wolfe do it before, wrestling with a case until the truth came out, until the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. But this time, it felt different. Viola had played a dangerous game, and Wolfe had called her bluff. He'd outsmarted her, exposed her lies, and left her with nothing. But as I sat there in the quiet of the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. Viola Tarman had been stripped of her power, her empire dismantled. She had lost, but I knew her. She wasn't the type to go quietly. She would always be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Wolfe was right, of course. The game never truly ends. But that was the nature of the work. There would always be more cases, more mysteries, more people, like Viola, who believed they could control the narrative. And as long as Wolfe was around, there would always be someone to stop them. Someone who saw through the lies, who noticed the smallest details, who was never fooled by the game. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor, and walked to the window. The city outside was as chaotic as ever, the world moving forward, oblivious to the intricacies of the cases that had unfolded behind closed doors. The streets were busy, the lights still flickered in the distance. But inside the brownstone, it was quiet again, almost too quiet. I looked back at Wolfe, who was sitting in his chair, flipping through a book. His attention was fixed, his mind already on something else. He had finished this case, but he wasn't one to linger on the past. He moved forward, always moving forward, looking for the next puzzle to solve. "Wolfe," I said, breaking the silence. He didn't look up. Yes. Archie, do you think she'll come back? I asked, my voice quiet. Wolfe put the book down slowly, his gaze shifting to me. His expression was as unreadable as ever. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. I don't think so, he said. Not in the way you mean. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to explain. But he didn't. He simply sat there, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly as if he had already moved on to the next case, the next mystery, the next puzzle to solve. I wasn't sure if he meant Viola wouldn't return, or if he meant the whole game would continue. But it didn't matter. Wolfe had already solved the case. He had already exposed the truth, and that was all that mattered. I turned to leave the room, but Wolfe's voice stopped me. Archie, he called, his tone almost soft. The truth may always come to light, but it's not always enough. Some people will never accept it, and that, my friend, is the real game. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There would always be people like Viola, people who would fight tooth and nail to keep their secrets buried, to maintain control over the world around them. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how much they manipulated the narrative, there would always be someone who would see through the lies, someone who would make sure the truth came to light, and that someone was always going to be Wolfe. I had no doubt about that. With that final thought, I left the office, stepping out into the night. The world was still spinning, still full of mysteries waiting to be solved. But for now, the case was over, and Wolfe, he was already looking for the next one.